At this juncture in the semester, um, we find ourselves exploring a number of themes and ideas that focus particularly on the text themselves. We are sort of advancing into the actual text, the literature of the 20th century, of African American writers of the 20th century. Some of you have completed your essays and have sent in those assignments and so on, which is good work. In some instances, I would just wanted to sort of but to give a heads up that if you probably are better off when you're thinking about writing your essay, at least the second essay, to choose a topic that we've had some discussion on, and we've had some discussion about themes and ideas that are there. You do have a list of questions that covers the full course, but it would seem to me that it would be to your advantage to write an essay on a topic that we've had some discussion on, which would frame some of the ideas. But of course, it's a free country in that sense, and there's no stricture on it. Today, we're going to look at a number of things, and it's an introduction to African American poetry, and this talk will be in 3 or 4 parts. And I want to give a general introduction to African American poetry, which will then lead us into some closer discussion. We've already started into the work of Langston Hughes. African American poetry is understood only in terms of locating the existence of that poetry within the American experience. And in a sense, African American poetry is born and grows and develops pretty much at the same time that American poetry grows, develops, and becomes a thing. We will be able to identify black writers from the 17th century, 18th century, and 19th century who were known to have produced work and produced a significant amount of work. But of course, because of the level of opportunities for literacy among African Americans during the period of slavery, there's a limited number of writers that would have emerged. One of the most interesting writers who would emerge is, of course, Phillis Wheatley. And Phillis Wheatley, who was an enslaved woman in Boston, in the Boston area, was enslaved in the late 18th century, and she lived through a period of enslavement and became quite famous as a writer during the American Revolution. And in a sense, it's the first inclination of what an African American writer, poet especially, begins to deal with. Here are a couple of things to bear in mind, and I think they're worth paying attention to when we think of African American writing, and especially poetry. There is a sense in which poetry is shaped around the question of content and subject matter, and then, of course, the question of form. The poetic form has varied in most cultures and has existed in most cultures. And poetry probably is one of the oldest artistic forms and expressions that we have a record of. And it's old and exists in multiple cultures because it's about voice. And it is directly and inextricably tied to song, to sound, to singing, to music. And this is very important, but it's also verbal expression in relationship to music. The form of the poetry is something that is developed in different cultures and in different ways, and in a sense, the form is the vessel in which the ideas, the feelings, and the thoughts are poured into to create what we call poetic expression. And I mention this because when we think of Phillis Wheatley, we're thinking of a poet who was writing in the Western European tradition, as most of the poets writing during that period, in the early American period. Most of them would, because of course that's a tradition that they came with, and that's a tradition of literacy that they came with. But as some critics have argued, there's a sense in which the role of the poet as a speaker, as a griot, as somebody who speaks into society and who speaks into the idea of what a society should be, the role of that poet is one that Phillis Wheatley also embraced and came from an African tradition. The griot tradition in Africa, at least in Western Africa and parts of Northern Africa, is the tradition of the poet singer who is part of a guild of artisans and who have existed in the society, and their role has been in the society in many ways, in many instances, in families that was their role in the community. And that family, generation after generation, would be the carriers of the history of the community. They would be the carriers of the poets who give voice to lamentation, voice to moments of joy, marriage, voice to warfare, voice to history. This is what we call the griot, and the griot tradition was very much a part of most African societies. And there's no question that Phillis Wheatley, who was enslaved in Africa, captured in Africa, and brought to America, may have been familiar with and had some knowledge of this tradition. And even if she didn't, she certainly was living among Africans in the enslaved world of America who probably would have. So there's a sense in which one could argue that Phillis Wheatley is working in the tradition, in the tradition of the griot. But her formal work, that is in terms of how her poems are constructed, came from what she learned. She learned to write, and she learned to write by the enslaved people that were there. Her content is interesting because Phillis Wheatley was always navigating the question of being a black woman being an enslaved woman who was writing in a world in which her ability to write was an affront to the society and was illegal in many instances. And there was a perception that somebody having the feelings and the intellectual wit and wisdom to write poetry could never be a black person, because a black person is of lower intellect. It was presumed to be of lower intellect and of lower feeling than a poet should be. And so there's a sense in which Phillis Wheatley represented a remarkable phenomena, and she proved to be a remarkable phenomena. She didn't gain riches because of her poetry, but she certainly succeeded as a poet that had an impact on society. So it's a very interesting tension that I think Phillis Wheatley represents, writing in the language of her enslavers, writing in the language of her colonizer, and yet writing as a way of expressing her sense of self and her understanding of her role in society. She is a model for the African American poet going forward.